Je me mets devant.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this third edition of the Trade and Environment Week. I'm Ek Ho Lim. I'm Director for the Trade and Environment Division. Myself and my colleagues who are seated here in the room as well are really pleased to welcome you all. I have with me a very distinguished panel, some of whom are online and some of whom are in the room. So those who are in the room with me, great pleasure to welcome Ms. Yvonne Higuero, who is Secretary General of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. Thank you very much for joining us. We, of course, have our Deputy Director General, Jean-Marie Pogam. I'm glad you could join us this morning as well. Thank you. And we have Dr. Ralph Payet, who is Executive Secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. Thank you, Ralph, for making this opportunity for coming here. And at the end of the podium, we also have His Excellency Ambassador Simon Manley, who's Chairman of the Committee on Trade and Environment, and also the Permanent Representative for the United Kingdom. And online, we have Madam Sonia Layton-Cohn, who is the Acting Deputy Executive Director at UNEP in Kenya. So thanks so much for joining us online. And we will also have a message from David Cooper, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So you have a full panel of some of the really important multilateral environmental agreement organizations with us this morning. And it's great to have them here, as a lot of our cooperation is about the relationship between WTO and MEAs, particularly in terms of how we can work better together, collaborate further, and improve the coherence between environment and trade. Now, this is an opening session. We'll be having different remarks from the panel, and after which we will turn more properly to the next event. Let me just say very quickly before turning to Jean-Marie, is that we have a full week of activities this week. So it's a really full Trade and Environment Week. There will be many events throughout the week, which you can join both in person as well as online. Those of you who can, we really encourage you to join online. We also have an exhibition going on in the atrium. And so please, if you can, after this opening session, wander around or any other time during the week. So that's enough for announcements, really. So I won't really get into any opening remarks as such, because I think the opening remarks are already very well prepared for Jean-Marie, and he's more than ready to offer you these opening remarks. So let me just turn immediately to Jean-Marie. Thank you, Jean-Marie.
Merci. Madame la Secrétaire Générale, Monsieur le Secrétaire Exécutif, cher Président, Excellences, chers délégués, Mesdames et Messieurs, Olim vient de le dire, à l'occasion de cette semaine de l'environnement, nous avons voulu accueillir dans l'atrium de l'OMC quelques très belles œuvres d'art que je vous invite à prendre le temps d'admirer. Elles portent des messages forts sur les raisons qui nous réunissent aujourd'hui. Une sculpture nous invite à réfléchir sur la double nature du carbone pour notre planète, à la fois origine de la vie et cause de sa destruction. Une sélection de photographies évoque la montée des eaux. Des objets ont été mis en perspective pour témoigner de notre malheureuse addiction au plastique. Plusieurs peintures contemplent tristement la fonte des glaces. Toutes ces œuvres nous disent, nous crient plutôt, devrais-je dire, la même histoire. Il n'y a plus de temps à perdre. Le changement climatique tue dès à présent chaque jour. Il représente un danger avéré et immédiat et personne, aucun secteur économique ne peut plus ignorer le défi de la soutenabilité environnementale. Le commerce et l'OMC ne sont pas isolés cliniquement, je cite une expression connue de l'organe d'appel, de cette réalité. Bien au contraire, il suffit de regarder autour de soi. Les récentes inondations au Pakistan ont submergé plus d'un tiers du pays, le faisant passer en quelques semaines du statut d'exportateur de produits alimentaires à celui d'importateur net de produits alimentaires. Le fleuve Paraná, qui transporte 90% du commerce international des produits agricoles du Paraguay, 85% de celui de l'Argentine et 50% de celui de la Bolivie, est confronté à des sécheresses qui provoquent des encombrements et des retards importants dans les voies navigables et les ports. La faiblesse des niveaux d'eau du Danube et du Yangtze affecte aussi les transports et les chaînes d'approvisionnement. Certains pays, certaines économies risquent de tout perdre. Par exemple, les pays insulaires du Pacifique, aux îles Marshall, Kiribati et Tuvalu, plus de 95% des infrastructures sont situées dans des régions côtières, vulnérables à l'élévation du niveau de la mer et aux phénomènes météorologiques extrêmes. L'Afrique nous inquiète particulièrement. La Banque africaine de développement estime que 5 à 15% de sa croissance annuelle sont dilapidées à cause du changement climatique. I move now to English. We need to act boldly and rapidly to confront this reality and turn trade into a fully sustainable economic activity. The private sector is leading and is already implementing huge investments for that purpose. Trade policy must support and amplify this global effort. Bilateral and regional agreements have shown the way. This is now happening at the WTO. First, and most importantly, our members are showing their determination to act against climate change and for sustainability. We already made good progresses. The recently concluded fishery subsidies agreement prohibits subsidies for illegal and unregulated fishing. It is the first WTO agreement with sustainability at its core. It will protect marine biodiversity and the interest of the 260 million women and men whose livelihoods depend on healthy oceans. There are 3 new initiatives on trade and environment sustainability, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and elimination of trade in polluting plastics, which are currently being held by 89 WTO members representing approximately 90% of world trade. Since our last ministerial meeting in June, climate change is now being fully recognized as part of the WTO agenda, and many technical discussions are already happening in various fora within the WTO, goods, services, standards. Second, our leadership is acutely aware and committed towards sustainable trade, which we consider central for the future of trade and the fight against food insecurity. Our DG, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, will soon convey this message to the global community at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, next November. We will there launch our new World Trade Report, which this year will be entirely dedicated to the trade and climate change nexus. Third, our civil society's constituents are on board and helping, as everyone could see recently during our public forum. I want to thank the campaigners who have been supporting the fisheries agreement and are supporting actively the campaign for its swift ratification, as well as the restart of the second phase of negotiation. Thanks to businesses and businesses organizations for our dialogues on decarbonation of value chains, carbon standards, biodiversity, plastic pollution. Thanks for the academic works from institutions which are giving food for thought to our negotiators, and for the events and discussions that are being organized here in Geneva. Last, and of course central today, I would like to express my profound appreciation to partners of the Multilateral Environment Agreements, secretariats who are here today, UNEP, CITES, CBD, and BRS, for participating in this panel on trade and environment cooperation. The collaboration between the WTO and Multilateral Environment Agreement Secretariats dates back to 1995, and we have worked closely throughout the last 27 years. I want to highlight particularly the very strong ties which we have with UNEP, with whom we are collaborating closely on a number of pressing issues. Together, we already have been ahead of the curve, as shown by our joint 2009 Trade and Climate Change reports, and our study in 2018 on making trade work for the environment, prosperity, and resilience. So you see, all stars have now aligned for a real change. What should that change be about? In short, we have to boldly move a big step beyond what we have been doing in the past. In the past, the law of this land was the WTO does not stand in the way of environmental policies. Some of you are familiar with the old appellate body ruling in the 1998 shrimp turtle case. It made clear that WTO members can take trade action to protect the environment by way of derogation from WTO rules. For the future, the law of this land ought to be the WTO fully enables environmental policies. This is what our members are now exploring, new initiatives that seeks to cultivate and strengthen positive ways in which the WTO plays on the climate and sustainability challenges of our time. Maybe more humanly and modestly, let's foster collaboration between the trade and environment communities, which is an essential driver of this change. Building these bridges is the raison d'etre of the WTO Environmental Week. Ambassador Manley, dear Simon, you chair the committee whose work we are celebrating this week. And as the chair of the city, you carry the huge responsibility of making all this happen. I just have one wish to formulate for this week. Let's move from contemplating problems to imagining solutions, from words to action. Let's make it happen. Ambassador Manley, dear Simon, the city is a very inspiring committee, and these are very inspiring times. This is, as you know all, a members-driven organization. Chair, members, please drive and drive fast. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for those opening remarks. We now have Madam Sonia Layton-Cohn, the Acting Director, Deputy Executive Director of UNEP. She's online. I see her online. And let's pass the floor on to her. I hope it's without any technical hiccup.
I think you will be fine. Can you hear me?
We hear you, but if you could speak closer or closer to the mic.
Is this better? May I start?
Yes, it's very good. We hear you well. Please start.
Okay, thank you. So good morning from Nairobi, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. UNEP is very pleased to co-host this important dialogue along our friends at the WTO as part of the WTO Trade and Environment Week 2022. For years, UNEP and the WTO have worked closely to make global trade more sustainable and equitable. This is because we believe that trade has a crucial role to play in building resilience for future shocks. We have joined forces to fill knowledge gaps, build capacities, and deepen policy engagement to take advantage of all 3 billion people relying on the ocean for their livelihoods, of which the opportunities we have to address the challenges, forgive me. At the outset, let me congratulate WTO members on the successful agreement on fisheries subsidies reform adopted at the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO in June this year. This is the first WTO agreement that is focused on environmental outcomes and a major step for ocean sustainability through the prohibition of harmful fishery subsidies, which have been contributing to the depletion of the world's fish stocks. We were also very pleased to see 3 WTO ministerial statements in 2021 on trade and environmental sustainability, reducing plastic pollutions, and promoting trade in environmentally sustainable plastics and fossil fuel reform subsidy. These achievements reinforce the resolve of the trade community to tackle the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature, and biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste. These developments have set a positive precedent for negotiations at the WTO and can have far-reaching impacts if implemented effectively. Ending illegal, unreported, and unregulated, that is the IUU, fishing and environmentally sound management practices will support a sustainable blue economy, create jobs, improve food security, and the lives of the more than 3 billion people relying on the ocean for their livelihoods, of which the majority are in developing countries. It is true that we live in unprecedented and difficult times. Rising food and energy prices have been exacerbated by conflicts and the economic devastation caused by the global pandemic. We are seeing just how vulnerable global patterns of trade, consumption, and production are to these and other shocks. A joint report by FAO and WFP points to a deeply concerning trend I'll share with you, that the number of people experiencing acute food insecurity is expected to rise to more than 200 million people in 53 countries and territories by the end of the year. I'm sorry, but I'm hearing an echo.
There's a slight delay, but I think you can continue.
Okay. But these pressing challenges and crises underline the importance of the transformation towards a sustainable, resilient, and green economic model founded on the principles of a circular economy, and trade can and should be part of the solution. So how can we make trade be part of this transformation to build a resilient economic model that is in harmony with the planet? Allow me to share the example of the global negotiations soon to be underway around plastic pollution. At the resumed session of the 5th UN Environmental Assembly in Nairobi earlier this year, member states delivered a resounding verdict to kickstart negotiations towards a globally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. The adoption of the plastic resolutions at UNEA affirmed the urgency to strengthen global coordination, cooperation, and governance to eliminate plastic pollution. This intergovernmental process presents an opportunity for the world to create a thriving new economy with new business models, new jobs, and new market opportunities, and to deliver a deal on plastic pollution that can set a model of circularity for others to follow. We need a new economy for plastics based on circularity, which looks at plastic waste as a resource rather than an environmental menace. This would require shifting away from our business as usual scenario and redirecting investment at the scale of USD 1.2 trillion towards the infrastructure required. There are tangible benefits from a systemic change to a circular plastic sector, such as the creation of up to 700,000 jobs, the reduction by 80% of the leakage of plastics into the ocean and land ecosystems, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2040. A circular transition in the plastic sector warrants action across the plastics life cycle, from reforming environmentally harmful fossil fuel subsidies to delivering responsible waste management policies. International trade must be part of the solution by acting as a vehicle to harness these opportunities across geographies, especially in middle and low-income countries. Increasing market access to sustainably produce plastics or sustainable alternatives to plastic products. Trade could stimulate required technological innovation that would facilitate such a shift. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, building greater resilience for our global economy can only be done by creating more coherence between trade, finance, development, and the environment. Trade and environment ministers should come together to the table for this end. UNEP and WTO have a strong partnership on environment and trade, which has the power to bring together our respective communities of trade, industry, environment, climate, and finance to accomplish these joint objectives. We look forward to continuing this cooperation and supporting member states in their efforts to promote sustainable trade and secure, healthy, equitable, and prosperous lives for their people. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam, for those excellent remarks, and also for the very interesting idea of bringing trade and environment ministers together. Maybe that's something we could work towards at the future Trade and Environment Week. So thank you very much, Madam. I'd like to turn now to our panelists here at the podium, and I'd like to invite Dr. Ralph Payet, Executive Director for Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, for his remarks. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you very much, and wonderful good morning to you all present here, but also colleagues joining online. It is indeed an honor for me to have been invited here to this August meeting, and as we do every year, it's an opportunity for us as the multilateral environment agreements to discuss with you and also to hear from you the concerns and also prospects for us how to move forward. And I hear from Jean-Marie the urge and the push for us to start driving fast, of course, in an electric vehicle, not one that will contribute to the greenhouse challenges that we have before us. So as you know, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions are very much ingrained, both as conventions with trade-related issues, but also has developed a very strong collaboration with the WTO and, of course, this August committee here in terms of our ongoing discussions on the nexus between environment, development, and trade. And we've seen our discussions move from silos, which I think everybody agrees in the past we've been really looking at things in a silo, to looking at the whole picture. And there we've seen, as expressed by the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP, looking at things in a more circular fashion. And as you know, the Basel Convention itself looks at the life cycle of products. That means we cannot tackle the challenges of transboundary movement of waste without looking at the sources of the waste, at how the waste is generated itself, and even more so now as we deal with the challenge of plastics, we're even looking at the design of the various products, which of course the design further upstream has a big impact on whether we can recycle those further down the road. And by bringing together the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, we've also looked at how we can have the circular approach as well. So the three conventions under one secretariat really kind of strengthens this circular thinking and circular approach. So we're very much in bed with you all on this issue of looking at circularity, but also more deeply at the life cycle approach. And this another point to that is also the linkages between the waste and chemicals to the sustainable development goals. Yes, many would have wished that we have an SDG on waste or on chemicals, but as I've argued many times before, the issue of chemicals and waste is linked to each and every SDG, whether it's poverty, whether it's gender, whether it's the oceans, whether it's industry, and we can find the linkages, whether it's with food, water, and all these important developmental topics under the SDGs have something to do with the chemicals, the products that we use, the technologies that we utilize, and of course, the waste that results from many of these activities. The waste hierarchy is the backbone of the Basel Convention, whereby parties commit to take actions to prevent. So that's the most important thing, prevent. But of course, it's almost impossible to prevent waste. And the second one is, of course, to minimize then the waste if you cannot prevent them. And through the use of various strategies, which you have become familiar with, the R's, we keep on adding more R's to the R's, but basically, you know what I'm sharing with you here: reuse, repair, recycle, recover, and so on. And I think the Basel Convention has been the force majeure in trying to drive at the national level, working together with industry and the private sector, and now with the trade organization is trying to really reduce the impacts of waste on both the local environment, but most importantly, on the regional and global environment. And we've seen from studies, for example, in the Stockholm, that the waste that we generate has a unique ability of coming back to us in the form of our food, in the air we breathe. And a report just came out that now we have microplastics or substances from plastics in breastfeeding milk, which then points to the massive loading that we've been having on our planet of plastics, to the point now it's really ubiquitous with our lives. We've seen it in food, we've seen it in the air, and now recently in the mother's milk. And of course, if you look back at the chemicals that have been listed under Stockholm, we have them present, obviously, in the mother's milk, but also in our bodies. And we've been walking around with this list of toxic chemicals, which doesn't seem to stop growing. And each time we find new chemicals in our bodies, in our bloodstream, and definitely in remote environments, such as in the Arctic and also in remote islands. Now, there have been some important policy developments since we last met. And the first one I want to share with you this morning is the importance of distinguishing between products and waste. This has been always the challenge of the Basel Convention, and I'm sure is a challenge that dominates and will dominate the discussions here in the committee. The waste non-waste interface is a central aspect of the Basel Convention and has been a challenge, especially in relation to electrical and electronic waste. Currently, our parties are considering an amendment proposal from the European Union on this specific issue, which is expected, among others, to contribute to the transition towards this circular approach and circular thinking. This stream of work is even more important in light of the expanded scope of the waste covered by the Basel Convention. And here I would put a little line in between and saying definitions is central to the work that we do in international relations and international negotiations, because we all have different definitions. You know what happens, we will talk forever and forever without really understanding each other. So one of the work that the Basel Convention has been doing is really trying to know and at some level also come to some agreed definitions that we can all use. And I'm hoping and looking at the city as well to helping us in that endeavor, because a lot of these definitions also have trade-related implications. And this is an important work that we need to do, as we also work, for example, with the World Customs Union, who has to develop a standardized nomenclature for us when we exchange not only goods and services, but also waste which needs to be recycled, recovered, and going beyond that. And as you know, indeed, the landmark decision that was undertaken by Basel on plastic waste, we still are looking at the impacts of those. We're still learning whether this is effective. And as you know, at the last COP as well, we had an amendment also on electronic waste. And these are all learning curves for us. We are waiting for information coming from countries, from regions, to see how effective those measures have been, and also what are the challenges that are being faced by countries as they have to adjust their movements of waste across borders. The e-waste amendments, which became effective, will become effective on January 2025, is also important to highlight to you, because countries will have to put in place certain measures, both policy and regulatory, for them to be able to adjust to those amendments. And we'll be rolling out, especially for countries requiring capacity and needing capacity, to support them in implementing those amendments. Moving on to the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, at the last meeting, which we had earlier this month in Rome, the POPROC, it agreed to recommend the ubiquitous plastic additive, which we call UV328. Just know that it's a plastic additive, which is has now been determined by the POPROC, which is the scientific committee of the Stockholm Convention, as having persistent organic pollutant properties, which means it can travel over long distances, it can accumulate in our body, and of course, leading to toxic effects. And this will be recommended for listing on the Conference of the Parties. And just for information, we currently have a number of chemicals being considered, which are additives to plastics, to be listed on the Stockholm Convention. Of course, that will have implication in the end use. As you know, some of these additives, for example, UV328, is useful in protecting and ensuring extending the life of plastics exposed to the sun, for example, in the outdoors. So in a sense, we'll be looking at alternatives and looking at how we can replace those types of plastics additives in the long term. And in fact, we have now 33 POPs, persistent organic pollutants, listed under the Stockholm Convention, and 15 chemicals or groups of chemicals that we can put them in a group called plastic additives, contaminants, or even byproducts. And one of the biggest challenges that we have when we'll be discussing recycling of plastics is, of course, those contaminants that remain in the plastics once we recycle them. And this has been the subject of discussion in the Basel Convention, but also in the different events and processes leading up to the INC. And I'm sure this will come up during the intergovernmental negotiations for the International Treaty on Plastics. Finally, I would like just to share with you some of the important contributions of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions in addressing climate change. As you know, there's very important linkages between climate change, chemicals, and wastes. And in fact, we published a report together with the Minamata Convention last year on the linkages between chemicals, wastes, and climate change. And I'm happy to share with you the link to the report, which is online on our website, so that you can also have a look at those. Just for information, the waste management sector contributes, as far as we know, 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. I believe it's substantially more, especially we have a lot of undocumented landfills and dump sites around the world. And these, of course, are breeding grounds for emissions, not only methane, but also other long-lived chemicals, which have an impact on the greenhouse, the total greenhouse gas emissions. We've also been, PCB, as you know, is listed under the Stockholm Convention. We've also been working together with energy companies and electricity companies to replace those transformers that contain PCB oils. And I'm very happy that we have 9 countries now. Yes, there are small islands in the Caribbean that have actually met the requirements of the Stockholm Convention and completely phased out virtually, if I can say it that way, PCBs, which shows us that we can do if we work together and we can achieve these milestones in the phase out. Of course, for larger countries where they have more complex industries, that will take time, but we are making progress. And I think that's an important milestone to celebrate. We've also working with UNCTAD, UNODC, and UNEP, and we are hosting a side event at the UNFCCC COP27, which will be held in a few weeks in Sharm el-Sheikh. And we will be discussing unmanaged waste as a hidden cause of climate change and looking at plastic waste as a primary area of interest. As you know, there's as much illegal transboundary movement of waste as there is legal transboundary movements of waste. And this is, of course, we can design all these wonderful international instruments. We can design all these wonderful exchanges between countries for circularity. But if there's leakages in the system, then we won't be able to achieve the targets that we've set at the international level. So we need to also look at how we can plug these leakages, especially when we look at illegal trade in waste, and plastics is a big part of this. So this initiative really shows how we need to continue working together. We need to continue collaborating, and we need to explore linkages and areas where we can work. And an emerging area we're seeing now is with the Montreal Protocol, for example. They are meeting very soon for the MOP. And one of the areas, of course, is dealing with refrigeration equipment, which is beyond their life use. And of course, how do we reduce the waste arising from that? So this is an increasing area of work that we are doing with the Montreal Protocol. I would like to finish by referring, of course, I've shown in my presentation the linkages with the triple planetary crisis, but I would like to really encourage you for us to continue working towards those targets that we have. I mentioned the PCB target, which is coming up in 2 years. There's been a lot of work done, but of course, a lot needs to be done. But we are seeing the progress that we are doing. And in fact, through the global monitoring plan, we are seeing decreases in some of the POPs, which is showing that the Stockholm Convention is really working in terms of reducing the amount of these toxic chemicals in the land, sea, and air interface. So with those few words, Mr. Chair, Mr. Moderator, Lim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rolf. That was again very good. And thank you very much for continuing the thread of the discussion on circularity and plastics and resource and waste, in particular, the intersection with trade. And now we're going to switch to another aspect of this intersection on trade and environment. I like to invite Madame Yvonne Higuero, who is the Secretary General of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, CITES, who is again a very close partner with us at WTO. And so, Madam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Mr. Jean-Marie Pogam, Deputy Director General, WTO, Mr. Ho Lim, Director, Trade and Environment Division of WTO, His Excellency Simon Manley, Chair of the Committee on Trade and Environment, MEA colleagues, and UNEP Online. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is really a pleasure to be here today to be part of this very distinguished panel and working with our partner WTO, who we think is very important in terms of ensuring that wildlife trade is legal, sustainable, and traceable, which is our goal. In our least modest moments, CITES might think of itself as a poster child of the intersection between trade, environment, and sustainability. Some of you may know that next year we will turn 50. It will mark our 50th year of existence, working on to regulate the international trade in endangered wild animals and plants. The convention is one of the earliest among the multilateral environment agreements, and it was signed in 1973 and came into effect in 1975. It regulates international trade, and some are very surprised to hear this, in more than 40,000 species of wild animals and plants. The goal of the CITES permitting system, of course, is to regulate this wildlife trade and to ensure the sustainability, the legality, and the traceability. Why am I here? CITES parties adopted a resolution by consensus that says where economic value can be attached to wildlife and a controlled management system is implemented, favorable conditions can be created for investment in the conservation and sustainable use of the resource, thus reducing the risks to wildlife from alternative forms of land use. In other words, well-managed trade in wildlife can further the resilience of both our ecosystem and local populations. Today, the 8 billion people on our planet are consuming millions of products in their daily lives that are derived from wild animals and plants, often not even knowing the relationship between what they are eating, how they build their houses, how they dress with nature. Many of us don't have any idea of how it's part of the web of life. These species, some of which are regulated by CITES, include fish and other marine species, and congratulations to the WTO on the fisheries agreement, as well as many plant species. I always like to highlight that of all the species of wild animals and plants regulated by CITES, which includes high-value timber like rosewood and commercial marine species, the vast majority of them are plants. And I also like to say that not all of them are cute animals, big mammals. We also regulate things like eels that are not that cute, but very important for our food, and also that are very much endangered, especially the European eel, which is listed on CITES. So we must think beyond the cute big mammals, which are very important, but also those plants and animals that really maintain our ecosystems and our livelihoods and our well-being. What may also come as a surprise is that CITES allows commercial international trade in over 97% of those species that are listed in the appendices, provided, of course, that all rules are respected. More than 1 million CITES permits are issued every year, and no trade is authorized unless if it's going to threaten the viability of the species in the wild. This is the goal. This is what we call sustainability. This is what will allow us to continue trade in these natural products that underpin human well-being. The achievement of sustainable, legal, and traceable use of wildlife is in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the CITES vision, the CITES party's vision, aims to bring this about by the year 2030. A lot of pressure. The pressure is on. But then again, the pressure is on all of us sitting here today, all over the world. Biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution are the 3 planetary issues that we must face down if we are to leave a healthy planet for future generations. Over the next 6 weeks, there are a series of meetings. You may know very well that you will be very busy in the next months after having the pandemic and being able to open up again and have our conference of the parties for many of the MEAs. We're having them all almost at the same time. And these meetings will determine the path that we will take. For example, the UN Climate Change Conference, we talked about that. We also have the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands will come about in November, followed by our own CITES World Wildlife Conference, and then the CBD conference of the parties, which is now negotiating the global biodiversity framework, which we hope will bring not only biodiversity MEAs together, but also chemicals MEAs together to work on a plan to ensure that we are using biodiversity sustainably and we are conserving it for future generations. We are, of course, in constant touch with our UN colleagues and non-UN colleagues, as we recognize that none of these challenges can be tackled in isolation. The natural world, nature, is integral to our response to climate change, and we have to keep climate change in check to allow biodiversity to bounce back. Some of you have seen that at the end of last week, a major report was published by the Worldwide Fund for Nature and the Zoological Society of London that showed that some populations of animals have dropped by around 70% in the past 50 years. Let's be clear, these numbers cannot be sustained. We are in a time of crisis, and we either act now or a different kind of action will be forced upon us just a little later down the road. Of course, we see that partnerships and collaboration are the way out of these crises. We are pleased to work in partnership with the WTO and others, and most recently, this has given us the pilot edition of the World Wildlife Trade Report. I'm very proud. It's the first time we will be releasing this, which will be available just before the start of our COP19, which is starts on November 14th. This pilot report is a first attempt to provide as comprehensive an overview of wildlife trade as possible from all angles. It considers the roots, the scale, and patterns of international trade in CITES listed species, together and very importantly, with the values, conservation impacts, and socioeconomic benefits of such trade, as well as the linkages between legal and illegal trade. And for me, this is very important because a lot of work has been done on the illegal trade, which is a scourge, which is, as you may know, the fourth most profitable illegal trade after drugs, arms, and human trafficking. But we have numbers associated with that, but we don't have a lot of numbers associated with the legal trade and what benefits it brings. So I think this report will be very important to bring this to light. Over the past years, we have gathered case studies from around the world that demonstrate the benefits of legal and sustainable trade in CITES listed species to livelihoods and the conservation of those species and habitats. This report has more evidence on how legal trade benefits local and national economies and should motivate greater investment. And I think this is absolutely essential. We need more investment by all stakeholders, especially by the private sector and industry, to have that long-term vision that if these resources disappear, there will be no business and no industry depending on this wildlife, on these wild animals and plants. And this way, we conserve and we stop overexploitation, we avoid land conversion for other uses, and enhance resilience. Answering crisis and furthering resilience is about having evidence-based regulations in place that we must enforce. And you here, most of you representing parties, we have 184 parties in CITES. All of you probably here are part of CITES. And enforcement and implementation is the most important thing that we could ask. We have many MEAs in existence. We don't really need anything new in terms of the environmental MEAs, except for of course, what we're working on now for the plastic pollution. But in terms of biodiversity, we have plenty of MEAs working on biodiversity. The problem is implementation and enforcement. And we need your help to be able to ensure that, but also your help towards the developing countries who need capacity building, who need technology transfer. This is what we ask of you. As Secretary General of CITES, I know that parties are taking the tough decisions to address the crisis that we face, but without, as I said, effective implementation, we will fail. We need to work with others to have the breadth of impact necessary to respond to this enormous scale of challenges. We welcome this week's meeting. We believe that actions will come out of this meeting and must come out of this meeting. Human progress was built on trade. But it is not enough to look just to the past. And as you said, Mr. Deputy Director General, we must work together on a new model for the future, faster than we have done before, one that has sustainability at its heart and leaves our communities, our nations, and our world stronger and more resilient than ever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Thank you, Secretary General. I think you did really very clearly explain, sustainable trade and wildlife. And I think that's a really interesting model that you just mentioned on CITES. And, I am tempted to have a few comments, but I'm also recognizing the time and I should really move on a bit. So I'll suspend coming with any comments and move straight to the next speaker, who is Mr. David Cooper. He's actually doing this by a video message. So if the team is ready with him, maybe we can put him on. CBD has been mentioned already a few times this morning. So Mr. David Cooper is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to thank the WTO Secretariat for the opportunity to talk to you today on behalf of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. While we cannot be with you live due to our heavy schedule just a few weeks ahead of our Conference of the Parties, I'm very pleased to contribute a few remarks to your important exchange of views. The parties to the Convention have taken considerable interest in the relationship between the international trade regime and the CBD, and for a long time, with requests for observer status in relevant bodies of the WTO going back 2 decades. This interest is perhaps rooted in the recognition that international trade, as a particularly prominent expression of the economic dynamics in an increasingly globalized world, can be both a driver of biodiversity loss, but also a potential helper in achieving biodiversity policy objectives. In the CBD, this general interest has galvanized a number of specific work streams. There is first the relationship between intellectual property rights and the TRIPS agreement, and the third objective of the convention, that is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources, as well as access to and transfer of technology. This was discussed intensely during the negotiations of the Nagoya Protocol, and I note that it is still part of the Doha mandate to look into this relationship. Second, there's the potential role of trade policies to act as an incentive for trade flows that are beneficial for biodiversity. It is from this perspective that we're looking with an interested eye at the discussions on environmental goods and services under the Doha agenda. Third, there is the potential role of trade policies to address trade flows or trade-related financial flows that are harmful for biodiversity. I'm pleased to note some progress on all of these areas in the past decade. The recent achievement by the WTO in adopting the agreement on fisheries subsidies at its 12th Ministerial Conference in June this year is very significant. It contributes not only to SDG target 14.6, but also Aichi Biodiversity Target 3 of the 2011 to 2020 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. Parties are now intensely discussing successor to this target in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And from this perspective, the adoption of the Fisheries Agreement constitutes significant progress and can give a real boost to the implementation of the Convention. We look forward to further progress to discipline and phase out harmful fisheries subsidies, and it is also our hope that such progress can be replicated in other economic sectors. I also wish to highlight our fruitful cooperation with the community working on sanitary and phytosanitary measures on addressing pathways for invasive alien species, one of the major direct drivers of biodiversity loss globally. This led to a number of useful policy guidance documents being adopted by our parties, leveraging further technical cooperation activities. My thanks to the Secretariat, to the SBS Committee, and to the standard setting organizations for their support and collaboration. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, let me note that we are experiencing an unprecedented global decline in biodiversity, leading to a loss of resilience and ecosystem services that jeopardize achievement of the SDGs and increasingly threaten our well-being. If we want to achieve the 2030 Agenda and the CBD's 2050 vision to live in harmony with nature, we will need to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity this decade. Indeed, this is the focus within the Convention as we prepare for the second part of COP15 in Montreal, where we are due to adopt a post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. To be successful, the framework will require a whole-of-government commitment to its implementation. The examples I mentioned show how the international trade regime can contribute and how we can put that often elusive mutual supportiveness into practice. I hope that we can build on these successes and further replicate and scale up these contributions in the remainder of this decade. I wish you a rich and fruitful exchange. I thank you.
Okay, so with that, we've completed the remarks from the panel. And I think I'd like to give the last word actually to Ambassador Simon Manley, our chair of the CTE, who's presiding over the Trade and Environment Week. So Simon, please, floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to our very distinguished panelists this morning for kicking us off in such sort of style and with such expertise. You don't need to go very far from Geneva if you're kind of wanting to see the effects of climate change. Just this year, for the first time since the time of the Roman Empire, a Swiss mountain pass, part of the famous Glacier 3000 ski resort, has lost all of its ice. But actually, of course, the heaviest hit countries are not, to be honest, here in Switzerland or in the OECD. They are amongst the poorest nations on the planet, whether that is Pakistan being hit by floods, or countries in the Horn of Africa or in the Sahel hit by dreadful drought. And you know, I think what we're discussing here and in our committee work this week reveals kind of one of those fundamental truths about you know, the dilemma of the global commons, in which while the primary costs of policies are borne by national jurisdictions, the benefits of those policies are shared by all, and therefore it is inherently an issue, an area where we need greater international, greater global cooperation. And I hope we're here this week, and indeed this panel this morning, to show that the WTO can be that place that can be a global forum for cooperation, where we can look at a number of environmental objectives, which panelists have spoken about this morning, whether that be fighting climate change, transitioning to a green economy, supporting sustainable development, and look to see how we can use trade and trade policy right across that spectrum to achieve our policy goals faster and more effectively. And in all of this, I think it's so important that we focus on the way that we can enable developing countries, particularly LDCs, to make that transition. There are, in this transition, both extraordinary challenges, but also tremendous opportunities for business, whether they be in Lima, Lagos, or Lahore, to benefit from the greening of global trade and the opportunities it can offer. And while I find it hard to meet the billing that Jean-Marie has so eloquently offered me and the committee, I do think that our committee, the CTE, has always played an important role in facilitating this discussion in all of its dimensions of the economic, social, and environmental. And let me take this opportunity to thank Ho and his extraordinarily talented and committed team from the WTO Secretariat, who support our work in the committee and certainly support me. So, I mean, ever since its establishment back in 1995, the committee has nurtured the sort of systematic engagement with other international organizations, which I think we've seen this morning in the panel. Let me thank Sonia and Rolf and Yvonne and David for their contributions this morning to our discussions and to setting the framework for our considerations this week. I'd like to think that as chair, that the committee remains a kind of bastion of discussion and an incubator of ideas, and a place where we bring these different initiatives, whether they be national, international, multilateral, plurilateral, to one place to generate both an understanding of how they fit together in that global effort, but also to generate greater understanding and to resolve misunderstandings about them. And we do so this week, of course, at a particular moment, not just because of the acute dangers that we see from climate change all around us now, but also because of some of the modest successes that we have had this year, and which give us hope that we can find ways to address these issues through WTO. And of course, right at the heart of that, as others have said, was MC12, our first ever WTO environmental agreement on fisheries. An important agreement, not enough, as we all know. We need to move further and faster to put it both to put it into effect, but also to address the issues which we didn't manage to address back in June. But also in the ministerial outcome document, a recognition for the first time of the role that this organization, trade policy, trade itself, can play in addressing the triple challenges, the environmental challenges that we face. And I hope that this week we can maximize the synergies from the discussions we're having, whether they be in the committee or in the course of Environment Week. We're going to hear over the course of the next few days from an extraordinary array of experts right across the issues that we're facing through traceability of supply chains, plastic pollution, climate development, circular economic transition, climate adaptation, resilience, through to trade, environmental goods and services. We're going to hear from think tanks, we're going to hear from business, we're going to hear from international agencies, as we've done this morning. But I hope we don't just think and listen. As others have said, we do not have the luxury of time. It took us 20 years to agree our fisheries agreement. We don't have 20 years to save the planet. We don't have 20 years to save the biodiversity of our planet. We absolutely need to move from discussion to action. Action to combat climate change, reach the goal of limiting the planet's warming to 1.5 degrees, action to work towards completing our SDG goals, action to substantiate this interface, to give real meaning to the interface between trade and environment. So let us start work this week and try to ensure that we come out of this week with a sense of how and with what measures we can actually take the actions that we need to save the planet that we so love.
Thank you very much, Simon. This brings us to the close of this opening session. But as Simon said, it's really just the beginning of the week. And we really hope that all of you will be engaging with us over this week. The events are physical in the sense that you can join them in person. So as many of you who can do that, that would be excellent. It remains for me to basically close the opening session. And I have to thank my team who've been sitting over here, from a Trade and Environment Division. There's Ludovin, there's Svetlana, Gagana, Sajal, Nelly, who's not here, and also Liz, as well as Vinati. Many of them have been contributing to making this work for this week. And so thank you very much for this terrific opening. And we have a coffee break now. The coffee will be served outside of this room, so please do use that opportunity to interact. And for those WTO members, we'll see you back in the room at 11:30 for the committee meeting itself. So thank you all very much again. Thanks very much. And let me give a hand of applause to our panelists.